In this Let's Texture episode, we'll texture steel beam supports and steel beam stands. These are modular assets that will utilize the same setup for dirt and for paint across multiple meshes. And you will see how to texture these modular steel beams by utilizing one single mesh, setting up the layer structure, using the paint, using the dirt, and then simply replacing with another mesh to continue utilizing the same setup you did the first time. Very effective way of texturing modular meshes to keep the same texturing theme and saving a lot of time in the process. In this Let's Texture episode, I will show you a lot of techniques, a lot of tips, and a way of speeding up your workflow. If you want to get these meshes to begin using in UE5, they are available for you to download and use on World Level Design Patreon. Support WLD and you'll get access to these 6 modular steel beams to use inside your environments. And if you need to learn how to use Substance Painter completely from scratch to texture your environments and your props, I have an extensive in-depth tutorial course, Substance 3D Painter Essentials, that will get you started so you can use Painter to texture with. And now, let's texture. First, let me show you the UVs, as it's very important to lay out your UVs properly so you can texture in Substance Painter. So I will end up texturing these 2 stands separately, and then these 2 beams, the arch and the straight, these 2 together, because they'll be using the same texture, the same UV layout, as well as these 2. So let me open up the UV editor. So this stand right here, I have all the UVs laid out inside 0 to 1 space. And generally, you do not want to have any overlap in UVs when you texture in Substance Painter, especially if you are baking mesh maps. So I am going to be baking mesh maps because I want to get the smart materials to do the work for dust, for dirt to accumulate in certain parts of the mesh. So when I utilize that procedural dirt and dust generation, and generally you do not want to overlap your UVs because some parts of the UV layout, some UV shells are going to repeat and not bake quite properly. You're going to have some inconsistencies and some errors in baking. However, if you know what you're doing and you know where these UV shells are, you could overlap some of them, and that information, that baked info, will be baked in for multiple UVs, for multiple UV shells, and it's not going to cause any errors if you know how to lay them out. So for example, this piece right here on the bottom, I overlapped all these UV shells, so they will receive exactly the same bake and exactly the same dirt and grime, whatever I apply onto it. But because the way they are laid out and positioned, it's not going to create any problems. It's just going to simply repeat the texture across all of these meshes. I also overlapped 2 of these shells together, and the way I laid them out, you can see there is a seam right here on the edge, right there, as well as right here. So this should also work for baking because these 2 pieces are going to receive exact same texture. And exactly where I placed the UV shell cut on both of these meshes, it will not cause any baking errors. And I did this for quite a few UV shells in order to save space and to make this a little bit more efficient. Now this may not always be possible, but for certain meshes like this one, it will work. For this specific mesh, I may select the mesh itself. Only some of these shells are overlapping, but most of them have their unique UV space. So whatever I did for this one, I couldn't have repeated it for this one, especially for these big supports right here, because the way that this would bake, it was going to cause some baking errors, and for those baking elements to show up not where I wanted them to be. So for these 3, I needed to separate them. And because this is more of a symmetrical mesh, I did combine some of them and it will work. So it all depends on the mesh, and it all depends where those elements are and what the baking will do to your mesh in order to calculate the ambient occlusion, the cavities, and the position of each piece. So this will take a little bit of time, a little bit of experimentation on your part in order to understand what you can overlap and what you can't. And you may need to do a few tests to see how your mesh will perform. So these 2 pieces are separate and they have their own texture. So I will export each of these pieces separately and then texture them individually. But I will show you how to actually speed this process up once we get into Substance Painter. And then I have these 2 pieces together. So for the straight beams and for the arches, they have the same theme, the same kind of design. I combine both of these into the same layout. So I will export these 2 together in order to bring them into Substance Painter so I can see how the texture is going to go for both pieces. However, when I end up getting them into UE5 or UE4 or whatever game engine I would bring them in, these will be exported separately. And then the same texture, same material will be applied to both of them. But for Substance Painter to bake, I exported both of these. So I can have both in the scene and I can see what's happening when I texture. And I did the same thing for these 2. I combined them into the same UV layout. They will receive the same texture And for Substance Painter, I will export them both, so I can see them both when I texture them. And for all of these, no UV shells have been overlapped. They all have their own unique UV space. And again, this will help with mesh baking and to avoid those artifacts of elements not baking properly and just kind of causing artifacts from one part of the UV shell to another. So these are the UVs. And then what I did, I just took single individual mesh for the stands and I exported it as FBX. And to export as FBX, I've already covered this in extensive detail in many other tutorials. But what you do is you simply take the mesh, position it at 0, 0, 0, add its pivot point, and then go to File, Export Selection. I have a button on my tool shelf, so I'll just press that, Export Selection. It exports it as FBX. The settings are smoothing groups, smooth mesh. I give it a name, and I export. And I did this for all of the meshes. I did the same thing for this one, world origin. Exported it as FBX. For these two, I just simply brought them into the world origin, like so, somewhere close enough. So their pivot point will be positioned at the world origin, so ignore this pivot point on this mesh. I simply placed them close enough to the world origin, and I exported them together. So when they are brought into Substance Painter, they will be one single mesh. And I did the same thing for this. I just simply took these two meshes, placed them right here, close to the world origin. On export, the pivot point will be at the world origin, and these two meshes will be combined as one. And we'll end up also bringing this one into Substance Painter, so they are together and we can see what we're texturing. Here are the exported FBX files, 2 for the stand-in supports, and then 2 inside each for the arches and the straight beams. And these are the only ones I'm going to be using in Substance Painter, because again, I will export all of them individually for a total of 6 pieces when importing it into a game engine. So these are just for Substance Painter. And we're going to start off with this steel beam stand 01. Inside Substance Painter, let's set up a new project. Go to File, New. I'm going to use the template, Unreal Engine 4. This will also work for Unreal Engine 5. Essentially, you choose a template for whatever software or game engine you're going to be texturing for. The rest of this, I'm going to keep it a default because the template sets them up, and you may want to take a look at document resolution. I'm going to be working at 2K. You can always change this after the fact. And last, you want to choose a file, the mesh that you want to texture. So I'm going to hit select, navigate into the folder where I exported the FBX files, and I'm going to choose the stand 01. That's the first one I'm going to texture, and then we'll come back and texture the rest. I'm going to hit open. Once everything's been set, I'm going to click OK. First thing I need to do is bake my mesh maps, because I need to use the procedural effects of Substance Painter to generate dirt, grime, grunge, dust, or whatever I need on this mesh. So I need to bake mesh maps so Substance Painter understands the position, the curvature, the ambient occlusion, and all the elements within this mesh for how to apply those procedural effects. So I'm going to go to baking. I'm going to keep all the settings here default. They do a pretty good job. And then I'm going to hit bake selected textures and let Substance Painter bake the mesh maps. Once done, I'm going to go back to painting and take a look at the mesh itself and see if there's any problems, see if there's any artifacts, and there should not be. Because the way I UV'd and created the layout, I was very aware of the problems that may arise just from experience. So that UV layout was specifically created and laid out to avoid those baked mesh maps problems that usually happens when you overlap some UV shells. And it looks pretty good. I don't see any problems here, and it's ready to be textured. The one thing I like to do when I set up new projects is change the light. So instead of using the default light, the environment map set to panorama, I like to change it to a studio light. And I like using this Studio White Soft. Gives me more neutral light, a lot more light, and it removes all color from the environment map. And that's the one I'm going to use. Now, essentially, what you could do is use existing or downloaded smart materials and apply it to this mesh, and it will begin to texture your asset very quickly. So for example, I'm going to go to smart materials and I can look for paint and just drag any of these onto my mesh. And then go through the layers and tweak the settings. If I don't like this, I can just remove it and drag a new one. And if I don't like this one, remove it, drag a new one, and just basically test all the different smart materials that I may want to use. Some will look better than the others, and then go through the layer stack and adjust many of these properties to kind of fit my mesh. But instead, we're going to do this layer by layer ourselves. And the key to this is just knowing how do you want your mesh to be textured. What's the end result? So that way you know layer by layer what you need to add and where it needs to be within the layer stack. So for this mesh, I want it to be clean painted mesh with no chipped away parts. So this asset is made up of steel. It's a steel beams metal support. So underneath all this would be steel. And then there's a layer of paint, a coating paint layer on top. Now, I don't want to have any paint to be chipped away to show the steel underneath. It will be a completely painted steel beams or steel stand supports. And the only thing I want on top of this coated paint is dust and dirt and grime inside the cavities and the ambient occlusion areas to signify the buildup of that dirt and dust. So knowing this, all I need is a paint coating layer and then applying the procedural dirt and dust effects on top. So knowing what your outcome is and the result that you are after for texturing will make it easier for you to texture and add layer by layer of the effects that you need. So let's begin with the paint fill layer. I'm gonna clear this and we're gonna build everything layer by layer ourselves. So we're not gonna be using any basic materials or smart materials. So I'm gonna delete this basic simple layer that comes with a new project. And let's add a new fill layer. Let's rename it to paint. And with it selected, I'm going to go into properties and we're going to use all the channels here. We're not going to disable anything. We just need to control our color and we're going to control our roughness. Now this layer is not going to be metal. So by default, the metal is turned off and that is correct. Let's set up our base color. I want these to be more white, kind of very slight grayish color. So the color of paint is going to be off-white. And actually setting up your color for most meshes to be more grayscale, to be more white, makes it easier for you to adjust color inside UE4 or UE5. But you just simply pick the color that you would want for your mesh. And in this case, for this specific modular steel beam, I want it to be off-white. Something like this. The default color is actually pretty good. I do have a value, I already kind of have it picked out, so I'm just going to paste it in here. And it's this one right here. For roughness, I want it to be a little bit slightly more shinier than it is. So for my roughness value, I'm going to lower it to 0.25. And the way to see roughness, you have to position the camera at a certain angle to the light and then just move the light. So if I make it more dull, it doesn't really signify paint, maybe old paint that's been covered with dust and dirt. And in this case, I actually want it to be more shiny, more reflective surface. So 0.25 is what I'm going with. So here's the clean painted steel beam support. Now I need to add some roughness variation. Right now the roughness that I'm using with this fill layer, it's too clean. There's no breakup at all. It's basically this asset that just has been made in the factory and it just came out and it's brand new. And in my case, I want to have a bit of roughness variation. So it breaks up this shininess, like it's been standing in a certain place inside the environment for a little bit and it has some grime, it has been touched by people, some dirt has fallen on it, and we just need to break this roughness up. So for this, I'm going to create a new fill layer and name it roughness variation. In this layer, I want to disable everything except for roughness controls. And at the moment, this roughness variation layer overrides the layer on top. So if I go ahead and lower it, for example, you see if I disable it, it overrides everything that we set for the paint layer. So for this layer, for this roughness variation, my default value, let's go ahead and set it to 0.6. We'll be able to come back and adjust this later. So I want it a little bit more rough. So this way I'll be able to use the paint roughness of 0.25 and then the variation of this layer at 0.6. I kind of have the difference between these two values be controlled by something else. And in that case, it's going to be a grunge map. So the best way to add roughness variation layer is to create a fill layer, add a black mask, add a fill effect to the black mask, and then find a grunge map, a black and white texture to use to break up and add that roughness variation. I covered how to do this in another tutorial, 3 different ways of adding roughness variation. So you may want to take a look at that tutorial for a step-by-step. So to the roughness variation layer, I'm going to add a black mask, and then into the black mask, I'm going to add a fill. And inside this fill, I'm going to add a grunge texture I want to use to kind of break this up. So I'm going to go to textures, and it's this one right here, and search for grunge or dirt or whatever grunge texture you want to use. In my case, I already have one in mind, and it's fingerprint dirty. Adds a really nice effect. And there's a few fingerprint smudges here, and the one I want to use is this grunge fingerprint dirty. I'm going to go ahead and left click, hold and drag, and just drop it into my fill effect into the grayscale property. You can see that it begins to add a little bit more variation. So if I disable it, here's before, here's after, very slight effect. So I'm going to come back to the grunge fill effect layer into the grunge texture itself, and I can adjust a few properties. So I'm going to increase the balance a little higher, let's say to 0.8. So here's before, here's after. You can see we're adding a lot more. Actually, if I go on top, I can see it a lot better. Let me move the light until it hits it just right. So here's before, here's after, So the balance helps. And the contrast, I'm going to leave it at 0. I can up the contrast. That might be too much. So I'll leave it at 0, like so. And then I could go back down into the paint layer and also adjust it. I'm going to leave this at 0.25, and I can go to a roughness variation layer, not the mask and not the grunge texture, but into the fill layer itself, and also adjust it here. Kind of push the values more or less. So this way I have kind of 3 controls to determine my roughness variation. I think this is pretty good. Let's take a look at it from afar. Just gonna go around it. Again, the roughness variation, I don't want it to be too strong. Again, this is going to be mainly somewhat dirty and dusty coated paint on top of these steel beams. So I'm not trying to make them abandoned or stripped away or a lot of wear and tear. I just want to have a slight variation in the roughness and then a bit of dirt and grime in the cavities of this mesh. Alright, and for our next step is add in the dirt and the grime and the dust. I'm going to create a new fill layer. Let's name it dirt. And we're going to use a smart mask to take into consideration the baked mesh maps we did for this mesh, and then use the smart mask to add the dirt and the grime. So Substance Painter will understand where to put different effects procedurally based on the position, based on the cavities, and based on how this mesh was made. And this is why I baked mesh maps for this. And for most meshes, for most props, for most assets, you will need to bake mesh maps in order to use the procedural effects of Substance Painter. So for this dirt, let's adjust a few things. I don't need any of these channels except for color and roughness. So this way we can have that dirt have different roughness, and then of course we want the color of the dirt to be something else. So I'm going to disable height, metal, and normal. So we only have 2 controls. For the dirt color, let's just find something darker, something like this. We can always change it later. And for the roughness, we want it to be more dull. Dirt and dust is not very shiny, so let's put it to 0.8. And then we're going to use a smart mask to apply and take away some of this dirt and reveal the paint below. We're going to switch over to smart masks, and it's this 3rd icon right here. And let's clear our search. And you just simply take any of these and drag it onto your layer. You can see that it will add a black mask already, or a mask into your layer. What you could also do is add a black mask and then take any of the smart masks and just drop them into that black mask. But the smart mask itself will add that mask for you. So whether you add it or you just drag it, you will have this black mask created for you, or just create one yourself and just drop any of the smart masks in it. And as soon as you do, you can see that it's beginning to use the color and the roughness. It adds in a smart mask, in this case a mask editor, and you can go in and begin to tweak any of these properties for this smart mask effect and kind of take away more or less. You can see that it's using the position, the cavities, the ambient occlusion of the mesh and how it was built to add that dirt into the mesh or into the layer on top of the mesh. So in my case, I already have one in mind. Let me undo, and I'm going to search for the mask that I've kind of tested things out, and I just simply dragged many of these onto the black mask or onto the dirt layer and just looked at the effect that it would give me. And the one that I liked the most was dirt cavities. This one right here. So I'm going to drag it into my black mask, and it creates some nice subtle effects in the cavities and around the edges, and kind of build up of the dust and the dirt. And all I have to do is go into the Mask Builder Legacy, select it, and then begin to tweak the levels of how much I want this effect to be applied and how much dirt I want. So there are a lot of settings depending on the smart mask that you're using. So you'll just have to play around and control all these values, control the grunge, control the curvature, control the contrast, the levels, and many of these settings. Depending on the effect that it added, you may have some of these settings different than what you see here. But essentially you just go down the stack, move the slider, read what the name is doing, and begin to adjust and control how much of the effect that you want on your mesh. And if the dirt color is too much or you want to change that color, just go back to the dirt layer, to the layer itself, the fill layer, and change this color, the base color, to something else and make it less intense, kind of blend in with the white paint more, maybe a more gray, or you can even change the color to something brown if it's actual dirt. In this case, dust is more gray. So I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to tweak the settings here for the Mask Builder to exactly what I would want. So here's what I ended up with. I just toned it down, changed the color a little bit, modified the grunge and the level effect of this Mask Builder, and just kind of made it a little bit more appropriate for this mesh. And then just take a look at your entire mesh and see if everything is looking good, and it is. Now if you wanted to take this a little step further and make it more where there's a metal wear and tear happening and you want to see the steel underneath, what you could do is introduce a steel layer below the paint layer. So for example, let me show you how this would work really quick. So here I have the paint layer. I'm going to introduce a new fill layer, drop it down below. This would be steel. Actually, let me disable the paint layer so we can see the steel. So steel needs to be metallic, and then the paint would be applied and painted on top, of course. So let's take the steel and make the metallic set to 1. And then let's tone down the roughness a little bit more so it's more shiny, just for the effect. 0.25. I could add some scratches to the steel or some dirt. I'll keep it as is. Let's say this is very clean steel and then paint is on top. So now we have our paint that's been painted on top of the steel. And then for this paint, I would add a black mask or just leave it as is, but then take a look at my smart masks. In this case, I'm going to add a black mask so I can just drop one of these effects, one of these smart masks onto the paint black mask I created. And let's search for, let's do metal or edge. And just take a look at some of these. We have edge, strawn, scratched, edge is strawn. I'm just going to drop one of them just to show you the effect, but there's a lot of smart masks you can take a look at. I'm going to drop it into the paint layer. And you see that it's taken away some parts and it's revealing the steel. However, it's doing it the opposite of what I would want. So I can actually invert the effect that it's doing. So let's go in the mask editor and let's global invert. So this way I have steel underneath that's been revealed with mainly paint on top. This doesn't look too good, so I can just delete these effects, these layers, and drop a new one. Let's do this edge rust, for example. And let's invert this one. And again, I would just go back and forth. This doesn't look good at all. Not for the effect that I'm going for. Maybe I can try some of these. So I would just continue doing this and find the right amount and the right settings for whichever effect that I'm going for. In many of these, you would have to turn down the amount of some of these settings in order to kind of tweak and kind of begin to reveal the steel underneath as it's been chipped away from the corners, from the edges, and from the wear and tear areas of the mesh. So that's just an example. I would just go through and find the right smart mask to use with proper settings that I would need to tweak. But in our case, this is the effect that I'm going for. This is where I want this mesh to texture. I just want a nice, clean, painted white look. I'll have the ability to change the color inside UE5 by setting up the materials properly. And I just wanted a little bit of dirt and grunge and dust in the cavities of this mesh. So this is what I like this mesh to be textured as. The next step after you've done texturing this one single mesh is to export your textures. So first I'm gonna rename the texture set list to something else because the name of the texture set list gets applied to the name of the texture. And I don't want a Lambert one, I want something else. I will end up with multiple textures because I'm gonna bring in the second mesh with the 3 steel rounded supports and then the other 2 for the straight and the arc and for different designs. So I need to name them properly. So when I export, each texture will have a different name assigned to the exported textures. So in this case, I would name steel beam support 01, for example. The next one would be 02. And for the arches and the straight beams, I would name them something else. To export your textures, go to File, Export Textures, Ctrl-Shift-T is a shortcut. Choose the output directory where you're going to export your textures into. So I'm going to click on this and point to the directory where I want to save the textures into. And it's going to be right here, into the Steel Beams Supports folder I created inside Textures folder. Then select your output template. In this case, I'm going to use Unreal Engine 4 Packed. You have a lot of other templates that you can choose depending on what you export your textures for. And of course, you can create your own custom setups as well. And I have one for Unreal Engine 4. I'll just use the packed one that Substance Painter comes with. Everything else is going to be default. So the size of the texture is going to be 2K. That's the one we were working in Substance Painter. You can always change this by using a different size to output your textures as. I'm going to continue using the based on each texture set size right here inside Painter. PNG, 8-bit, everything else stays at default. And then hit export. Your textures have been exported. There's going to be an emissive texture, but it doesn't get exported because we don't have a emissive channel set up. So it's not going to create an emissive texture for you. And let's go ahead and close this and take a look what we exported. And here are the textures. Here's the albedo, here's the normal map, and here's a packed ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic. 3 textures packed into one single texture. And in Unreal Engine 5 or 4, you'll be able to use each individual channel to input into the material in order to use that channel. So the red channel is ambient occlusion, green channel is roughness, blue channel is metallic. So this mesh has been textured and we've generated our textures and exported them. Now we have 3 other meshes. One that's a stand and then 2 meshes inside one, so we can texture them in Painter and see the results at the same time for the 2 different straight and arch beams. So how do we bring those in and just reuse the same effects that we used for this mesh but on the other meshes, without having to set up exactly the same thing, having to write each of these down, then apply it to the second mesh and the rest of the meshes as we bring in. So what you could do is you can reuse the same scene and just replace the mesh with a new mesh. The layer stack will be the same, and then you just bake your mesh maps and it will generate a new set of textures based on the mesh that you replaced it with. So here's how this would work. Go to Edit, go to Project Configuration, and then click Select to replace your existing mesh that you're using with a new one. And in this case, let's choose the Steel Beam Stand 02 and click Open. Nothing else gets changed here, just click OK as long as you replaced it with a new mesh. New mesh has been brought in. Of course, it's incorrect because it's applying the previous baked mesh maps from the previous mesh. Let's go to Baking. Bake your mesh maps here, just rebake them. And that's it, you're done. Switch back to painting and just take a look at the mesh, see if there's any problems with the baked mesh maps and your UVs. In this case, I know there isn't any because the way I laid out my UVs, I shouldn't have any problems, and I don't. So now this new mesh that we just brought in and rebaked our mesh maps has the same folder structure, has the same effects, has the same settings. And all you do is export these new textures for this mesh. Just make sure you rename the Steel Beam Supports to, let's say, 2. Control-Shift-T, the shortcut key. The same settings will apply. The new name will get assigned, so we're not going to override the existing, the previous mesh. And I'm just going to click Export, and we're done. And here are the 3 new textures right here. Here's one, here's the albedo, normal, and the packed ambient occlusion, metallic, and roughness into a single texture. And then you repeat the same steps for the other meshes you brought in. So this way it allows you to quickly reuse and rebake your mesh maps, change the name, save the textures, and saving a lot of time in the process. Perfect way for when you have the same theme meshes and you just need to reapply the textures and the layers to the new set, and great way of reusing what you already did. So I'll just do this one more time, but for the other meshes, let's go to Edit, Project Configuration, let's select the arches with the holes. I think these are 02. Let's click Open, click OK. You can see that I brought in both of them because we exported both of these as a single FBX file, and I just need to bake my mesh maps. Here we go, we rebaked them. Let's go back to Paint, take a look if we have any artifacts, any issues, and we do not. And we apply the same layer stack and the same settings for these meshes. And all I need to do is rename this to something else and then export the textures. And I'll have another 3 textures to use for these meshes. And then you repeat with any additional meshes you have. One more step I want to show you is being able to generate a mask of this dirt and the grime and or whatever else you've applied through your smart mask to create these procedural effects. It often helps to have a mask that you can use in order to control this dirt individually from the entire mesh. So in UE5 or UE4, you can set up your material to where you can change color of the mesh itself, but not affect the color of the dirt. And then you'll be able to control the dirt color individually. And that requires you to have a mask so you can control the paint color as well as the dirt color and the areas in order to update that dirt color. So having that control individually is very important. And the way you generate a mask is simply export the smart mask, this black mask for the dirt, as the mask that you can use in UE4 or UE5. If I Alt left click on this icon, this will show me what the mask is doing. The white parts is what's revealing the dirt. The black parts is what's revealing the paint. And we can use this mask as a way to control the opacity and the effect of the dirt to change the dirt color and how much of it gets applied. So all I need to do is right click on this black mask and export mask to file and then save it as a PNG. So I'm going to name this Steel Beam _ support _ 01 mask. And I will have to do this to every single mesh that I need to use a mask for, because I will have different textures and obviously different mask for whichever mesh I bring in and have to rebake the mesh maps and then save the textures. So I will end up having 4 different masks that I will need for all these meshes. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the new name, make sure I add in the mask so I know what it is, .png. So I save it as a PNG and save it into appropriate folder. Here I quickly navigated to the folder where the other textures are, and I'm going to click Save. And again, I just want to make sure that I have the same name as the other ones, so it's easier for me to find. So the way the exported textures are named, it uses the name of the mesh, then it assigns a texture set list, and then assigns a base color at the end. And then you will have, of course, roughness, the packed roughness, and the normal map. You can rename these, of course, as well as setting up your own custom template, so you remove some of these names. In this case, I'm just going to give a mask at the end and click save. So now I have a mask to use. Let's click back on the icon so we get back to our material view. And here is the mask. The only thing about exporting your mask, the way I did it, is it saves your PNG as a 16-bit texture file and as a grayscale. And you don't need 16-bit textures for your masks inside UE4 or UE5. So you would have to open it in Photoshop, go to image, and change the mode to 8-bit. And I also would change it to RGB. So this way I can have additional masks that I could pack into individual channels. So this way I could have inside the red channel a mask for one beam or for one asset. In the green channel I could put another mask that I could use, and then I could also do another mask in the blue channel. So this way I will have one single texture, and I can pack in 3 different masks into individual channels for me to pick and choose whichever one I want to use, thus optimizing of having just one single texture instead of 3 different textures. So whenever I export masks from Substance Painter, by right clicking on the mask, it gives you a 16-bit file grayscale. So I always open them up in Photoshop and I change them from grayscale to RGB, and then drop it down to 8-bit channels, and then pack other masks into other channels for a packed mask texture. And last, I just want to show you what it looks like inside UE5. So I already imported these meshes into UE5, set up my materials, and imported all the textures. And the material itself is set up to utilize the mask that we exported in order to change the base color on the painted part, as well as be able to change the color on the dirt itself individually, using a simple lerp to blend between the two. And then everything else has a very simple setup for roughness, using the green channel and the normal map intensity. Simple setup, but very effective use of the mask. So I'm just going to show you on this one right here, because all the other ones have a different material setup. So here's the material instance. And if I just get a little closer, we have the default dirt and the paint. And then if I change the base color, actually not the base texture, but the base color adjustment, I can change the color of the paint itself without having to affect the dirt color. And if I want to adjust the dirt color, I come down to cavity dirt, enable this, and I can adjust it and make it darker, change the color to anything else. So you have full control here with just a simple mask to control the paint as well as the dirt individually. Now, if you want these meshes ready to go for UE5 with all the materials, all the textures, and all the meshes set up for you to use inside your environments, you can pick these up on World Level Design Patreon. Simply support WOLD and you will get access to these to begin using.